to week 17 of our second year of our journey through the Word. This week, we're going to be covering 20 Psalms. 3 of them we know were written by David. One Psalm, we're told, is a Psalm of Solomon, but we'll talk about that in a moment because some believe that it was written by David in actuality, but we'll look at that in a moment. We have 11 Psalms that are written by Asaph, and the question is, who is Asaph? We'll look more at that in a moment too. Then we have 4 that are written by the sons of Korah, and one of them is given a name, and he is Heman, the Ezrahite. And so who is he? And then one of the Psalms, we don't know who wrote it. As we look at these Psalms, we continue to see David's Psalms are filled with prophetic insight concerning Christ. In Psalm 69, we have a good illustration of that. David speaks about those who hate him without cause, and he speaks of his estrangement from his own brothers. We know this is true of Christ. We know that they spoke against Christ without cause, and we know that he was estranged from his brothers before the resurrection. It was only after the resurrection that they actually believed in who he was and accepted him as the Messiah. We also read in chapter 69 that it says, they gave me gall for my food and vinegar for my drink. We know that this is quoted in all 4 of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, speaking about when Jesus was on the cross. As you go through, see if you can see some others and see some shadows in there, again, concerning Christ, and see David's prophetic insight. Although David's Psalms are filled with pain and with turmoil, David has this beautiful heart that always looks to God for his strength and for his relief. He always knows that in God, he will have the protection and the help that he needs. Psalm 72 is the psalm that tells us that it was a psalm of Solomon. And many will take that it was written by Solomon. But many of the sages and the rabbis and the teachers of the Old Testament have said through the centuries and through the years that it wasn't written by Solomon, it was written by David, and that David actually prayed this over Solomon when Solomon ascended the throne. Let me give you one of the books that I use for study. It's a Jewish book. It's not a Christian book, but it's written by the Jews and written from their perspective. And I want you to hear their perspective on this psalm. This is taken from the Art Scroll and the introduction to Psalm 72. And it says this: David entertained great hopes for his son. As his death approached, David reviewed the events of his life and realized that many of his cherished plans for creating a perfect society based on the laws of Torah, or the Bible, remained unfulfilled. With his last breath, David charges his temporal and spiritual heir, Solomon, with the task of creating a utopian world predicated on divine righteousness and justice. Solomon came very close to realizing his father's great ambition, and to the extent to which he succeeded, his rule resembled the future reign of Messiah. Thus, the verses of this psalm apply both to Solomon and to his descendant, the long-awaited Messiah. And so we get a glimpse of what David saw in the future. He saw Messiah reigning on the throne, and all the world knowing who he is. That brings us to the 11 Psalms that are written by Asaph. But the question is, who is Asaph? Well, if we go to 1 Chronicles chapter 6, it gives us the divisions of the musicians that David appointed to minister over David's tabernacle, not the tabernacle of Moses, but the tabernacle of David after he brought the ark to Jerusalem. All 3 of the divisions are of the Levitical priesthood. All 3 of these divisions are from the line of Levi. And all three are represented by the chief musicians. What I've done is I have made this genealogical chart that will give you some understanding, hopefully, of what I'm saying. We know that Levi had three sons, Gershom, Kohath, and Merari. And each of those divisions are represented by a head musician, a chief musician. We know that in the Kohath's line, that middle line there, that Kohath, we have already looked at the fact that Kohath had a descendant named Korah. Korah was actually Kohath's grandson. And it's from Korah's line that Samuel came. We're familiar with Samuel, and Samuel was the 18th generation from Kohath. We also know that Samuel's grandson was named Heman, and that David appointed Heman over all the musicians, not just the musicians from the line of Kohath, but he was over all the musicians, and even over Asaph and over Ethan. According to 1 Chronicles chapter 6, we find that to the right hand of Heman would always be the descendants of Gershom, and that Asaph was the chief musician of those Levites who were of the Gershom lineage, and that his descendants, Asaph and his descendants, were always to the right of Heman. To his left, we find that we have the clan of Merari. They also are descendants of Levi. And we find that Ethan is of the 11th generation from Merari, and that he is the chief musician of those who are from that clan. And so we see that all three of the clans of the Levites are represented by a chief musician, with Heman being the chief musician of all of them. And so it's this Asaph that we're looking at, this chief musician who we know wrote 11 of the Psalms that we're looking at this week. As we look at these Psalms, we come to Psalm 72, and Asaph, we see, struggles with the fact that the wicked seem to have everything going for them. They don't have money problems. They have the best of everything. They eat the best food and the best of the land, and they seem to die satisfied. And as Asaph looks at this and he ponders it, and it just, he struggles with the unfairness of what it seems to be. And it says that this plagued him until what? Until he came into the sanctuary. And it changed his perspective from the temporal to the eternal. He saw that there is coming a day of judgment, and that one day those who have had this easy life and all these riches, but have had no part of God and have not brought God into their lives, will one day see what really matters. And it's only then that we see Asaph's whole perspective changes, and then it all makes sense. God, help us to keep this eternal perspective in our life. It will help us to see that these carnal things, as much as they want to call to our fleshly nature and make this life so simple and so easy, that this is not what God desires of us. David put it this way in Psalm 119 and verse 71. It is good for me that I was afflicted, that I may learn your statutes. It's more important for us to know God and his ways and understand his heart than to have the monetary things and the earthly things of this life. And then we come to Psalm 74, which was also written by Asaph. And we hear another fact that we would benefit by if we keep it in mind, especially in today's world. And that fact is this, that the enemies of God set their own standards, while tearing down gods. We see this happen so much in our world today that there is this tearing down of what is good and right and just and the standards that God has set, and they are replacing them with their own standards, which are far short of God's. That brings us to Psalm 78. And it's in Psalm 78, it's filled with God's testimonies. We're going to continue in the days to come, see how important God's testimonies are. So what are God's testimonies? Psalm 78 is filled with the testimonies of God and what he's done for his people. As you're going through Psalm 78, I want you to pay close attention to how many of God's works that he did for his people had to do in some way with water. Just ponder that for a while. We will also see in this psalm and hear of God's rejection of Ephraim for his dwelling place. Why does it say that he rejects Ephraim for his dwelling place? Well, if we once again go back and remember that the tabernacle had stood in Shiloh for many years, hundreds of years, and then God rejected Shiloh as his dwelling place. And as we look at a map, you'll see that Shiloh is found in the territory and in the inheritance of Ephraim. And we're told that God rejected that dwelling place in Ephraim, and he established in Judah a place for his dwelling. And this is certainly a prophetic word for the temple that would one day stand there. And so watch for those prophetic messages of Jesus, the Son of David, and the millennial reign. You'll see that quite a bit in Psalm 78 if you're watching for it. In Psalm 84, which is one of my favorite psalms, also written by the sons of Korah, there's Psalm 84, verses 5 through 7, that's always speak to my heart. And it says this: how blessed is the man whose strength is in you, in whose heart are the highways to Zion, passing through the valley of Baca, or the valley of weeping. They make it a spring. The early rain also covers it with blessings. They go from strength to strength. Every one of them appears before God in Zion. I've mentioned it before, and I will mention it again today, that the highways to Zion are not found made of brick and mortar and stone or earth trodden. The highways to Zion are those paths that are found in a man's heart. It says that these highways will pass through the valley of weeping. We see this so often in the Psalms. We hear it in David's Psalms. We hear it in the Psalms of the sons of Korah and even Asaph's Psalms, that this life, as we've journeyed to have God and his paths in our life, that it'll bring us to the valley of weeping and through the valley of weeping. You notice it doesn't just say it passing to the valley of weeping. It says passing through the valley of weeping. They make it a spring. To make it a spring, what are they going to have to do? They're going to have to dig. They're going to have to get the earth that's in the way and move the earth and get it out of the way so that the waters can flow. We need to remember that when we're going through the valley of weeping and those difficulties, that as long as we wallow in that valley of weeping, we're going to stay there. But if we will begin to deal with our own humanity, our own earth, we will find within there a spring that brings blessings and will continue to lead us before God in Zion. So enjoy Psalm 84. As I said, it's one of my favorites, and I hope you enjoy it as well. In Psalm 86, now we are seeing a psalm that is a psalm of David. And once again, as we hear David's words, we see that David sees the future when Christ will reign and when all the nations will glorify God. I also see in this psalm that there's it's like a veil. And behind the veil, I see the three faces of God. In David says these things. He says, teach me your way. I will walk in your truth and unite my heart to fear your name. Teach me your way. Well, Jesus is the way. I will walk in your truth. Jesus told us that the Spirit of truth would come and he would guide us into all truth. And then he says, unite my heart to fear your name. The name. We hear this over and over again when we hear the Jewish blessings that are spoken, when it says, Baruch Hashem Adonai. Baruch meaning blessed, Hashem meaning the name, and Adonai meaning the Lord. Blessed be the name of the Lord. A name is not just a tag. A name is the character. And so we see Jesus is the way, the Spirit is the truth, and the Father is the name. And so I see all of God represented, and that David had an insight to that triune God. We see that David also understood the character of God. When he says, unite my heart to fear your name, who you are, the very character of who you are. And David says, I understand the character of God. The character of God, he's merciful, he's gracious, he's slow to anger, he's abundant in loving kindness, and he's abundant in truth. So often we mistake God's heart because his nature is so different than ours. We will often think that God is moved to anger because we would be moved to anger, when God actually is slow to anger. And when you see that God has become angry, you will find that it isn't just something that has quickly happened, but it is after generations and generations and generations, or time and time and time again, when people have turned their back on him and not embraced what he's done for them. We end this week with a psalm that we're told is from the sons of Korah, but it also says in that intro that it is a meskel of Heman the Ezrahite. Now, there's a lot of division and disagreement over who this Heman actually is. We might think, oh, well, this is the Heman, the chief musician. I don't believe so. And I know that there are many who agree with me that this is not that Heman. Some will say, well, it's the Heman from the tribe of Judah. There is a Heman that's mentioned in the Bible who is from the tribe of Judah, and many will say, no, I don't think it's either one. Now, I have my opinion. First of all, no one really knows for certain which Heman this is. And my opinion, and that's all it is, it's just my opinion, I have a tendency to believe that this man named Heman is also from the line of Korah, and that's why he is listed, and this psalm is listed from the sons of Korah, but specifically from a man named Heman, who is not from the same line as the progenitor of Samuel, but he is from a different line, and he is a descendant of a man who is called Ezra. That's my opinion. Doesn't matter which one really. What matters is what this psalm portrays and what it shows us. As you read through this psalm, one thing all of them agree is whether it's a rabbi from ages past or a rabbi today, or whether it's a Bible teacher, doesn't matter. As you read it, you'll see the same thing. You'll see that this is a very dark psalm, and that there is no ray of hope, and there is no praise of God. This psalm shows the despair and the hopelessness that there is for people who have no hope of God in their lives. This psalm will make us very grateful for the one that we will begin next week with. That one is going to be filled with hope and promise. We'll be glad to get there. So may we constantly be reminded of David's songs and his words that no matter how difficult life is, no matter what the situation, that we should always turn our focus heavenward and run into the presence of God. And there, and only there, will we find the strength and the hope that we need to face any situation. You know, the songwriters of today have caught that as well. One of the songwriters of today put it in these words: turn your eyes upon Jesus and look full in his wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. Be encouraged, and I will see you again next week.